Good afternoon. Let me welcome you all to our OP Jindal Distinguished Lecture of this semester. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, a professor here at the Watson School, starting this year, the Watson School of Public and International Affairs, and also professor in political science, but more importantly for the purposes here, the founding director of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia, which is hosting this lecture. Luckily, our founders are here. Welcome. Let me start with a bit of history of these lectures. Sajjan and Sangeeta Jindal, Brown Parents 2012, have endowed these lectures in perpetuity in memory of Mr. OP Jindal. That's why they're called OP Jindal Lectures, Sajjan's deceased father. The purpose of the endowment is, quote, to promote a discussion of the politics, both international and national, economics, culture, and social change in modern India here at Brown. And since the fall of 2012, these lectures have been held once every semester. And the previous lecturers include, to name just a few, economists and economic policymakers such as Raghuram Rajan, the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, which is India's central bank, F. Saduflo, the Nobel laureate in economics, Kaushik Basu, former chief economist of the World Bank and also former chief economic advisor of the government of India, Montek Ahluwalia, a principal architect of India's post-1991 economic reforms, novelists Salman Rushdie and Amitav Ghosh, historians Ram Guha and William Dalrymple, political scientists Atul Kohli and Uday Mehta, film director Meera Nair, journalists Siddharth Vardarajan, Ravish Kumar, and Shekhar Gupta, all from India. Our speaker today is Fareed Zakaria, a leading public intellectual of our times. He is the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS, a weekly show on CNN that most of us watch, and my deceased father couldn't live without it. He swore, absolutely. And also my father-in-law also said that he couldn't live without it. In India, they watched it in India every week. And a weekly columnist for the Washington Post. To my mind, and this is my conceptualization, my own conceptualization of Fareed's work, he truly exemplifies an important but increasingly weakening tradition, a tradition that combines scholarship and public commentary. As an example, read today's column, his column today in Washington Post, where America's current troubles in the Middle East have been examined in light of British imperial troubles at the turn of the last century. Absolutely worth reading. And a lot of scholarship put into that column. He has written 5 New York Times bestsellers, The Age of Revolutions, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, In Defense of a Liberal Education, The Post-American World, and The Future of Freedom. And in The Future of Freedom, he proposed a new concept for democratic theory, something that I've been spending a lot of time studying these days, once again, in preparation for writing a book on Indian democracy. And that concept is illiberal democracy. The concept he first wrote about in a foreign affairs essay in 1997, and that played a very big role in his 2003 book, The Future of Freedom. The concept of illiberal freedom was always there in some way, but no one quite captured it as well as Fareed did in the Foreign Affairs essay. And therefore, whether you read Adam Przeworski today, I can give you some democratic, in my profession, the leading democratic theorist, whether you read Adam Przeworski today or you read Stephen Levitsky, when they use the term illiberal democracy, Fareed is cited for that. That's how the concept was born. As a journalist, Fareed has interviewed Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Emmanuel Macron, Vladimir Putin, perhaps in Davos, I'm not sure, No?
St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg. Oh, my. Benjamin Netanyahu in New York.
In Davos and New York.
And I see.
I've interviewed him many times.
I see.
For my sin.
And Erdogan, among others. And I think Lee Kuan Yew in the 1990s. Yeah. He has received a Peabody Award and 3 Emmys for his television work, a National Magazine Award for his writing. In 2010, India awarded him the Padma Bhushan, one of the country's highest civilian honors. And in 2022, Ukraine awarded him the Order of Merit. Born and raised in Mumbai, he might call it Bombay. Salman Rushdie insists he would never call it Mumbai. I don't know about him. Born and raised in Mumbai/Bombay, Fareed holds a BA from Yale and a PhD from Harvard in political science. He will speak here for roughly 40 to 45 minutes. The topic is A New Star Rises, India's Potential and Promise. After that, we will open up for discussion. Please welcome Fareed Zakaria to Brown. This is not his first visit to Brown. He received an honorary degree from Brown some years ago.
Thank you so much, Ashu. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I first met Ashu when I was a graduate student, and he was an assistant professor at Harvard, and he was as insightful and intelligent then as he is now. So it's a huge pleasure to be, and it is a huge pleasure to be at Brown. I remember very, very fondly the commencement speech I gave here, and found it to be an extraordinary place. Probably more distinctive than any university that I've been to, in the way in which, for example, that commencement is really just the undergraduates and few university officials huddled together in that church. The undergraduates have played some part in designing the ceremony. So in mine, there was a bunch of people, undergraduates who come from Africa. So there were, West African hymns being sung along with old New England ones. I'm sure this is causing some people in Washington to shudder these days, but I thought it was magical and very American in its own way. So what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about the way the world is changing, and then where India fits into it, because I really do think we are watching one of these extraordinary tectonic shifts in global affairs that one watches very rarely. We are witnessing the end of one age, but we're not quite sure what the new age we are entering into will look like. For the last 80 years, we have lived in a system, an international system that was largely created, sustained, and defined by the United States. After 1945, one doesn't think enough about how radical a break this was. After 1945, the United States, and to a certain extent Britain, conceived of a new international order that would be wholly different from the ones that had preceded it. And this was very much part of Franklin Roosevelt's vision as to why the United States should enter World War II, how it should enter, and what the ultimate purposes of it should be. And the idea was that it would try to fundamentally reshape international relations so that you did not have the kind of nationalism, narrow self-interest, nationalist competition, and war that had characterized particularly the European world for centuries before. And in doing that, the Roosevelt administration and then the Truman administration insisted on a series of features that would be the defining features of that new order. Free trade was one of the absolute cornerstones of it. We went from a world with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, where the United States had become the leading protectionist power in the world, to being the leading free trade power in the world, insisting on a free trade regime for the world, a world in which there was an international association or an organization called the United Nations, a series of associated organizations, the so-called Bretton Woods system that helped govern international economics. And the idea behind all of this was very simple, that it should be much easier for countries to grow rich and powerful through economics and trade rather than through nationalism, competition, and war. Now, obviously, this was the kind of broadest and most generous aspiration of the what is now called the liberal international order. Large part of the world did not accept it, the communist world. There were many, many points at which the system existed more in the breach than in the observance, particularly by the United States itself at various points. But you still had this as the default, as the kind of default operating system of the international world. And while it went through many ups and downs, the most dramatic shift, of course, takes place when the Soviet Union collapses in 1989. And that system goes from encompassing, roughly speaking, half the world to the entire world. And at that point, the United States really does become the most dominant power in the world, and on a scale that really hadn't been seen since the Roman Empire. There was simply no country that could, in any meaningful sense, contest or compete with the United States. Just to remind you, in the early 1990s, China is about 2.5% of global GDP. Russia is in free fall. Russia's GDP contracts by 40% between 1990 and 1998, which is a greater contraction than took place during World War II. The richest countries in the world outside of the United States were actually Germany and Japan, which were both treaty allies of the United States that had accepted something completely unique in history, which was that as the second and third richest countries in the world, they would subcontract their foreign policy to the richest country in the world. The idea that a rival economic power would not choose to build up its military and contest the number one power, but instead accept a kind of subordinate status in which it subcontracts its foreign policy to the number one country, is not only unheard of, but violates every tenet of international relations theory, in which states are meant to balance against each other when they rise. But that was the world that existed. That world is over, and it's over for a number of reasons. I wrote a book called The Post-American World that Ashu mentioned, and I was in that trying to capture the beginnings of this shift, which I largely thought had to do with what I call the rise of the rest. You had had 4 centuries of the rise of the West, and you were entering a world in which was characterized by the rise of the rest. And very simply, the data behind it is about 30 years ago, the so-called emerging markets in the world made up about 5% of the world economy. Today, they make up about 50% of the world economy. So, it depends on exactly how you measure it, but that's roughly speaking correct. And if you look at global growth, they represent 60 or 70% of global growth. And that reality, the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil and Indonesia and all these countries was reshaping the world in a way that I think people had not, particularly in the West and in the United States, become aware of. The additional feature of what has happened since that period, which I did not completely anticipate, I must confess, in that book, was the voluntary abdication of its role as the leading power in the world that has taken place with the United States. Now, it hasn't taken place as a formal abdication, but what the United States has done is largely turned its back on many of the core elements that defined the system that it put into place. So if you look today at the world as it exists, the United States is once again the leading protectionist country in the world. It has gone from, broadly speaking, having the lowest tariffs in the world to, roughly speaking, having the highest tariffs of any industrialized country in the world, any advanced industrialized country in the world. It has gone from being a country that believed in the international system that it had put into place to one that openly violates. And I think the openly violates it part is important. The United States made many mistakes, violated those principles often, but it always tried to frame its actions in the context of a country trying to uphold those. So, for example, the Bush administration's war in Iraq. The Bush administration went to the United Nations, tried to get resolutions, had inspectors put in place, all done by an international organization and in pursuit of international objectives, tried to frame the issue in broad terms that affected the whole world, gathered a coalition of 40 plus nations, went to the United States Congress, and then went to war with Iran. Now, the war may have been misguided, but there was an effort to put it in the context of this larger international order that the United States believed in and was part of. The current war in Iran has none of those features. There was no effort to frame it in larger terms. There was no effort to go to the United Nations. There was no effort to go to Congress. The United States has exactly one ally, Israel, and that is not an oversight. That is, I think, by design. The Trump administration doesn't believe in any of those features. It wants the unilateral exercise of American power for American national interests as it conceives it to be the primary motivating force that defines the way the United States acts in the world. And that is a huge shift. And it is one that I think makes it very difficult to imagine how this international order survives. At the very least, it will need to be reconceived, almost recreated in some way if it were to survive. I think that the challenge going forward is even broader than the one I described, because if you go back before the United States, the leading power in the international system was Britain. And while again, British, you don't need to tell somebody who grew up in India just 20 or 30 years after the British were ruling the country. Britain could very often violate many of the values that it supposedly upheld. But Britain also had a kind of liberal international conception of its role in the world and of the international system. It was much more nascent, much more intermittently expressed. But if you go back to the 1870s, 1880s, what you see in William Gladstone, the 4-time Liberal Prime Minister of Britain, what you see in some of his writings and speeches is the beginning of what I would call the kind of liberal international view of world affairs, as articulated by a statesman. There have been people like Kant who had articulated it much earlier. But to have a sitting prime minister, as Gladstone was, talk about the role of human rights in foreign policy, the necessity for Britain to act in support of, the Bulgarians or whoever it was being oppressed in those days by the Ottoman Empire, was unusual. It was the first time you had a major power want to act in ways that were more about some kind of broader values. And of course, the Gladstone's tradition gets transmuted into Wilson and Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson then makes an effort at the first international organization, the League of Nations, which of course collapses because the United States, or in part because the United States never participates in it. And so you have really had an international system that for 150 years has been animated by a liberal hegemon that has been willing in some way or the other to articulate it and in some way or the other to underwrite it. London was the world's financial capital before New York. The British pound was the reserve currency before the dollar. The British Navy was the guarantor of freedom of the seas, and also involved itself in certain liberal foreign policies like the abolition of the slave trade, which was done almost entirely by the use of the British Navy. And so when you think about it today, you are confronting a world in which the great liberal hegemon, the United States, is retreating from that role, maybe even turning its back on that role. Other great powers are rising, and they have not a very clear conviction or disposition to extend that particular conception of international order. And so you enter into a world that Charles Kindleberger, the economist, described very well when he was talking about the 1920s. Britain was losing its capacity to play that role in the international system, and the United States at that point had no interest, was too parochial, too isolationist, too uninterested in playing that role. And that created the power vacuum of the 1920s that led to the rise of dictatorships and aggression in the 1930s. I'm not in any way predicting that will happen. There are a variety of reasons why it might not. But that is the nature of the challenge of the order we face. It's a period similarly in flux and similarly undefined at the moment. So into this international flux enters India as a very different country than it has been in the past. India is now, I don't know whether one would call it an upper middle power or a great power, but India is one of the most important countries in the world, without any question. It is the third or fourth largest economy in the world, the most populous country in the world, and has achieved, and is achieving, I should say, a level of economic and technological sophistication that is new. If any of you have the latest iPhone in your pocket, the iPhone 17, it was made in India. Every single iPhone 17 was made in India. About 25% of all smartphones and about 50% of all iPhones are now made in India. And what is remarkable about that is, particularly on the iPhone dimension, if you go back 4 years, 0 were made in India. This is India essentially replacing China as the principal manufacturer of smartphones for the United States within 4 years. It is the kind of thing you used to believe that only China could do, which is a kind of high precision manufacturing at scale. It was always thought that, you needed the kind of discipline and direction that the Chinese state could provide, which allowed for this kind of thing. And, to a large part, it used to be true. I had a friend who was a CEO who had factories in China and India. And I told him, what is the big difference between operating in China and India? He said, in China, when you go to these factories, people are very obedient. They just, execute. And it's very hard to get them to tell you, give you any feedback, tell you what's wrong with what's going on. And I said, in India, he said, in India, it's the opposite. You can't get people to shut up. Every worker has 3 ideas about how if they were owning the factory, they would transform it. I don't know whether that's true anymore, but for some reason or the other, while talking too much, the Indians are also making a lot of stuff and are doing it at a very, very high level. If you look at almost every area of advanced economics now, India has begun to participate. And remember, it's still, the potential remains huge because India is still a poor country. This is one of the things I now have to tell American friends when they are going to India, because in the old days, you had to tell them, I don't know if you'll be able to handle the poverty, and they were expecting it to be worse, and they'd go there, and I'd say, don't worry, you will be able to get a good meal, you will be able to stay in a clean hotel room. Now, when you go to India, you have to, people are expecting to see Shanghai, and you have to remind them, India's per capita GDP is still $3,000. It is still a country that is very much developing, but it has enormous potential, and it is realizing that potential. And what that means is India's foreign policy is changing. If you think about the India of the 1950s, to a certain extent, Nehru's foreign policy of non-alignment was born of necessity more than out of some grand articulation of values. India was a country that was not really powerful enough to be able to shape the international order. And so it wanted to avoid being shaped by it and stay out of the kind of great battle of the time, the Cold War. And that was there was a certain pragmatism to it. And the reality that Russia was close and that America had sided with Pakistan added to those dimensions. But it was a way of India not participating by staying removed and distant from the great tectonic struggle of the time. But India today is in a very different position, and therefore the non-alignment has moved to a multi-alignment. And multi-alignment, as Prime Minister Modi has expressed it and practiced it, is a much more active foreign policy in which India chooses how it will align itself and how it will conduct itself, and is able to do that because it occupies such a central place, both economically and strategically, that countries have to accept that India will not be entirely in their camp, but will do business with them nonetheless. So India is unusual in being able to buy Russian military equipment, buy Russian oil at a discount, while at the same time forging closer and closer ties with the United States, even militarily, even in defense terms. It is able to work out economic arrangements with Russia and at the same time with Europe. And that reality comes out of India's pivotal position. So I talked about the economic side, but obviously there is the strategic side that is even more significant, which emanates from the single most important strategic reality or strategic shift of the last few decades, and that is the rise of China. The rise of China has completely reordered the international system. If you think about it, the rise of China is really the first new entrant to the great power club in about 100, 150 years, right? Since the rise of Germany and Japan, you have not had a new entrant at that level. China represents that and represents a lot more because it comes out of a very old tradition. It comes out of a part of the world that has not had many great powers. And it is transforming the geography of Asia and the geopolitics of the world. And in that context, the world is searching for some kind of Asian balancer to China. And India seems to be the most obvious candidate because it can do it geopolitically, but it can also do it geoeconomically. If you think about the example I gave about the iPhone, it's very difficult to imagine any other country being able to, as quickly and as it did, and on the scale that it did, come into that market and provide a kind of alternative to China. And India can do that in phones, it can do it in other manufactured goods, it can do it in pharmaceuticals, it can do it in precursor chemicals, it can do it in minerals, it can do it in almost every area because of the size of India, the scale of it, and because of the fact that India does have fairly advanced technology and science. Manmohan Singh used to say that India exists in several centuries at the same time. And that is true for anyone who's ever visited India. You go to Bangalore and it feels like you're in the 21st century, and you go to Bihar and it feels like you're in the 17th century. And that reality is actually now turned into an advantage, because you can get low-cost labor in Bihar and high-quality engineering in Bangalore. And that means that India has this extraordinary, maybe unique role that it can play. Now, the current administration has not seemed to completely recognize that reality for India with its tariff policy, but it's fair to say that that is not just true of India. The Trump administration has not discriminated on the basis of race, religion, or geography. It has abused all its allies, and so India is only one among many countries that is bewildered by the fact that it has been placed in this position, trying to understand what it means, and some of it I think will sort itself out. But the longer strategic outreach that the United States has made to India over the last 25 years is, I think, likely to endure, because it is rooted in the geoeconomic and geopolitical realities that I was describing. And so I think that there is a new weight to India in the world. The potential, in a sense, is already being realized in that sense. The question becomes, can India also fulfill the promise that India represents in some way? Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that India is perhaps unusual, maybe even unique among the rising great powers. If you think of a Brazil, you think of an Indonesia, certainly you think of China, in that it is a country that also stands for something. It is not just an emerging nation that has become more and more powerful and economically competent and militarily strong. It's the biggest democracy in the world. It's a country that in many ways reflects some of the most important values of this liberal international order that I was describing. And in that way, it is different, I think, from a Brazil or an Indonesia, though both of them are democracies. Because India has been a democracy from the start. It was a democracy when there were very few poor countries that were democracies. And it has managed to maintain that democracy with one brief interruption for its entire independent existence. And that means it has perhaps a special role to play, given the context I was outlining in terms of where we stand. India could play a role as one of the key redefiners, recreators of this liberal international order, an order that would be based not just on might makes right, not just on spheres of influence, but on the idea of some certain values as well. And it's perfectly poised to do that because it has this rich tradition behind it. The challenge, of course, is that India, in its own way, has been straying from those very traditions. This is not, my opinion. If you look at the three institutes that rank democracies, that rate democracies around the world, all three of them show significant democratic decay or slippage in India. I think two of them place India in almost a zone where it would be an illiberal democracy. And if you look at the measures they're looking at, they're hard to argue with. Independence of the judiciary, independence of courts, all kinds of things that usually constitute the kind of inner stuffing of democracy have been moving in a difficult direction in India for the last 10 or 15 years. And so the challenge becomes, can an India that is experiencing some democratic slippage or reversal play this role in upholding a broader international order? I believe it can. And I think it can for a variety of reasons. To begin with, you don't have to be perfect to believe in some of these values and to uphold some of these values. Let's remember that the United States that created that international order was a United States that was actively and aggressively practicing Jim Crow in the South. That the man who conceived of this international order, Franklin Roosevelt, had never confronted his own party on Jim Crow in the South and all the associated, inequities that it involved. And it's simply a way to remember that, nobody is perfect. No country has ever been able to completely fulfill the aspirations of some of these ideas, and certainly no country that is very powerful. I often say that you have to compare the United States' reign as the leading power in the world, not with Costa Rica, but with the other leading powers of their time, and ask, if you're trying to figure out how well the United States has done, the Soviet Union, the Kaiser's Germany, Hitler's Germany, Imperial France, Imperial Britain. And India, in that sense, is a mixed bag right now. There are some areas where, when I look at India, it's extraordinarily dynamic. There are things to be incredibly proud of and to look at with extraordinary, almost awe, the way in which India is able to move fast and quickly, the way in which it has been able to reform some of the parts of both the economy and even the bureaucratic and political systems that seemed impossible to imagine being done. You go to Bombay, and I do still call it Bombay, Ashu. You go to Bombay now, the extraordinary build-out of infrastructure in Bombay is almost Chinese in its speed and efficiency. But you do have the reality I was describing, and there I think my hope for India comes from the reality that India is a very big, complicated place in which many things are happening at the same time. So you do have some of this democratic slippage, but you also have a country with enormous pluralism and vitality and civil and civic engagement at every level. And I think this may be, my own hope and perhaps even sense of India, prediction about India, is that the power of that internal pluralism and dynamism and bottom-up civic activism will, over time, ensure that Indian democracy doesn't move from greater illiberalism to illiberal democracy and then to authoritarianism. I think a country with so many different political regions, linguistic regions, caste differences, religious differences, is going to be very hard to run as a single monolithic country by one centralized regime. And if you look at the kind of cultural basis of Indian life, Hinduism, it feels to me, as a non-Hindu, but as somebody who grew up as a minority in India, that the defining feature of Hinduism is its tolerance. I can think of no other major world religion in which you could say you can be a vegetarian and consider yourself a strict Hindu, and you can be a non-vegetarian and consider yourself a strict Hindu. You can worship one God or 300 and consider that to be the absolute requirement of your religion. Hinduism has an extraordinary absorptive power. When you think about it, this is a country in which Buddhism was created, where Buddha comes from. And yet it's the one country where basically there are no Buddhists, because Hinduism just absorbed it. and said, oh, wait, you want to believe in nonviolence? We believe in that too. You want to believe in not killing animals? We believe in that too. You can go, you can do it wherever, it can incorporate almost any element of it because it is defined almost by its tolerance and pluralism. And for a religion like that, which is really more a philosophy of life, to take on an exclusionary, intolerant, but a kind of worldview or patina seems to me ultimately not what the DNA of India is and not what the DNA of Hinduism is. And I say this, with humility as an outsider, but as somebody who lived and saw that reality in the India that I grew up in, which was, I think, considerably more pluralistic and tolerant and secular than at times it has seemed today. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not one of these people who believes there was ever a golden age anywhere. The Bombay I grew up in had religious riots, very, very bad religious riots. People, coming to my door. But it also had enormous cultural tolerance, pluralism, and synergy. And when I came to America, I remember telling people that to me the big difference seemed that the America I was in, people tolerated each other's religions. In India, the India I grew up in, people celebrated each other's religions. We would go and celebrate Diwali and Holi. Our friends would come and celebrate Eid. Everyone celebrated Christmas. My uncle, in fact, who later on became an imam, used to be the Santa Claus because he had the big beard. He didn't have to get a fake one, and that was the kind of the India that I remember, and I think it's not just memory. There was a great deal to it, and so to my mind, if that India becomes more and more powerful on the world stage and articulates some of these values that are core to what it is as in its own way, then India can be a model for this new emerging world order, and it can help define this new emerging world order as one that doesn't involve a move to narrow nationalism, exclusion, and conflict, but instead one that represents more. And in many ways, India is a much more understandable model for most countries in the world. When I go around the world, and this is particularly was true about 5 or 7 years ago, you go anywhere in the world. I mean, I remember once even going to Iran and being told this by an official. We want to be like China. And what all of these countries meant by that is we want to maintain our dictatorship, but we want to get rich. And the trouble with that is it's very, very hard to do. There are very few countries that have figured out how to be extremely pro-market, extremely efficient, and extremely Leninist at the same time. That is a very, very complicated balancing act that the Chinese have managed to do, which very, very few other countries have. India, by contrast, is an open, messy, chaotic democracy, which somehow has managed in the openness, chaos, and democratic process to also grow pretty fast. When people will often moan about India, it's not growing as fast as China, which is true, and it will never grow as fast as China. China has had the fastest growth of any large economy in the history of the world, and it will not be equaled by India. But India has been the second fastest growing large economy in the world for the last 25 years. So it's not a bad record. If you compare it to the other 195 countries in the world, it's not China. And I think that in some ways it's much more approachable. It's much more manageable. If you're a developing country and trying to figure out how to grow, you're going to find more interesting lessons that you can copy from an India than you are from a China. And India, in that sense, can play a much larger and broader role. The question is, does India want to play that role? I mean, India has been unusually reticent over the last 3 or 4 decades to play a larger part in the world. In the 1950s and 60s, India was willing to make stirring speeches in the United Nations. I think of Nehru and Christaman and people like that, but do very little. It was, it was all rhetoric, often very self-righteous rhetoric, but it didn't go anywhere. Now it has taken on a much more practical cast, which I think is a reflection perhaps of the recognizing that Nehruvian era and the high-minded rhetoric got it very little. But it might be time for India to step up and start articulating its vision of the world and not simply try to make sure that it can cut a good deal with the United States and with Russia. And that vision, to my mind, would be one where India would have recognized that its destiny really lies with the West. First of all, there's a practical reality. India's economy is a much more natural partner for the Western economies of the world. It is a high consumption, consumer-led economy in very much the same way that the United States is. India is not a predatory export-led state economy, which is going to play a role that inevitably involves a certain degree of tension with the Western world, as you can see even now with China, as its excess manufacturing goods flood markets, not just in Europe, but in Southeast Asia. It produces an inevitable tension between that country. India is a much more open, consumer-led economy, largely driven at the high end by services. All of this is very compatible with the way in which Western economies work, and you could imagine a much greater degree of synergy. It's also true that India much more easily can be integrated into the West. Not every Indian speaks English, a mistake that many tourists make when they go, but a large number do. About 15% of the country speaks it. It means that there is a natural ability to integrate into the Western world. There is a large Indian diaspora in the West, which helps in that way. But more importantly, there is this alignment of values. In India, in its DNA, is part of this liberal world that believes in universal values. India has always articulated itself as believing in those. It just doesn't do it consistently. It doesn't do it loudly, but it is very much. If you were to ask an Indian what India stands for, it would be those kind of things. And in that sense, India has more of that sense of proselytizing than, say, a China. If you think about the difference between the United States and China in terms of its world role, the United States does have this high Protestant proselytizing mentality, which says, when you go to a place like Iraq, we want Iraqis to become just like Americans. We want them to become capitalists and Democrats, and we're going to transform that country. And you see echoes of that even in Iran today. If only we could get rid of the mullahs. They're all, the country is going to be transformed. We can't help it. That is in our DNA. The Chinese have no such conception. But the Chinese look at a country like Iran or Iraq, they would say they can never be Chinese because they're not Chinese. It is an entirely ethno-nationalist conception of what it means to play a role in the world. China's goal is to make China great, you can't transform other countries into China because they're not ethnically Chinese. I mean, it's two very different visions. And I think that India, being big and plural and messy and democratic and liberal, is actually closer to the American conception than to the Chinese conception. And so my hope has always been that India will be able to recognize that its destiny lies with the West. It would be good for India, good for its internal organization, but also good for the world. And I think it would be a powerful legacy for India to leave the world. It would be maybe too dramatic, too hopeful, and too extravagant to say you could imagine a world that went from English hegemony to American hegemony to Indian hegemony, having then had three liberal superpowers that define the world. but it's an aspiration that I can't help thinking about. The title of the speech, A New Star Rises, comes from Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech, which as a young boy, because my father was a politician, we used to hear this in the background of my house the way that my kids listen to Taylor Swift. And so even now, even though I don't think I've ever read the speech, I can still probably recite certainly the first paragraphs of it from memory. But when reading it for this talk, I noticed that a little bit further down in the speech, Nehru talks about a new star rising in the east. And he says it is a star of freedom. And so even there, right in the great founding document of India, is a reference to India's rise, but also to its values. And my hope is that what you see is not just an India rise, but is rising, holding its values intact for itself and the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Fareed. The last part was quite emotional. Let me rise above that a little. You were also, if I may say so, a little choked when you said they talked about Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech, undoubtedly. I still can't read it out to my class. I just stop somewhere in the middle because I try, but what happens to me when I read out that is what happened to you here.
Yeah. It's one of the most extraordinary pieces of political rhetoric in the world. I mean, it's extraordinarily well written.
Yeah. So, I would like to share your optimism. In a very deep sense, right? Not... But in order to not share doubts about this optimism, to not share doubts about this optimism would be unfair to our craft as political scientists and political analysts and observers. The pluralism, there were some remarkable things you said. The India in which you grew up, in which I grew up, I'm perhaps five years older than you, not more. The India in which you grew up and I grew up, you said beautifully, celebrated diversity, didn't tolerate diversity. It was a wonderful sort of distinction conceptually that you brought out. Yes, India in which you and I grew up celebrated diversity and almost defined India as diversity. Diversity is India. And of course, the great statement from the founding fathers was India achieves unity in diversity, right? Now, if you read almost every ideological text, and I'm saying almost advisedly, perhaps every ideological text of the current rulers of India, in Delhi, and in 20 out of 28 states, right? Not all states of India, certainly, but 90 to 20 states of India. The ideological texts, every ideological text of Hindu nationalism says India's pluralism is a problem, is a fundamental problem. That is why India is not strong. That is why India is not powerful. It drains strength. It drains it away, right? It's a fundamental weakness which must be remedied, right? So those who have ruled Delhi and at least 10 states for 12 years or so, and 20 states by now, out of 28, would not stand for those values that you think India can stand for, and could easily you're not saying easily, you're not saying something so simplistic, you're saying it has the chance, right? As the economy grows further, as it's now from 4 trillion to 6 trillion, so it's already the fourth or third largest, depending on how you count. And it's clear that it will be bigger than Germany in about 4 years. All exercises make it very clear. So only China, right now China is 18 trillion, India is at 4. So China could be 20 trillion by now. So India is 1/5 of China, even though India and China were roughly the same in 1990, right? But yes, it'll go beyond Germany in the size, total size, not per capita. And that will happen in 3-4 years. So as that happens, if the current rulers continue, why should we believe that an even more systematic attack on the pluralist history? So remember what Prime Minister Modi said to the 2 houses of Congress when he came here as a state guest in, was it June 2023? I think, yes. When he said 1,000 years of slavery India has gone through. 1,000 saal ki gulami. What is this concept? Which is there in every Hindu nationalist text. It is not something that he's come up with. This is something he grew up with. With the arrival of Muslims from the Middle East, begins India's slavery. And for him, India is Hindu. And Hinduism is India, right? In that conception. So the 1,000 saal ki gulami, 1,000 years slavery, is a defining concept. Right. With that ideology, if you are in power with the Jim Crow ideology, which happened in the American South as Reconstruction fell in 1880, and that continued for 85 years, in only 1965 did you legally undo Jim Crow. Right? Now, the attempt of this ideology is to create a legal structure. If it can. For that, it needs 2/3 of parliament, which has not been able to win yet. Right? For that, it needs 2/3 of parliament, and half of states it has. 2/3 of parliament and half of states can allow you to have a constitutional amendment. Right? So then you can actually legally make it Hindu nationalist. It is still not legally Hindu nationalist, politically increasingly so, but not legally so. Right? So let me stop here. You can see the argument here. The question then ultimately becomes, intellectual and political question ultimately becomes, why should we believe that the pluralism that your India in your childhood and teenage celebrated, that India in my childhood and teenage celebrated, that pluralism will return in a big way? And the speech that tryst with destiny speech, it can be achieved, if you will, with the rising prosperity, rising military might, and nuclear weapons power, etc. But its last paragraph can also be reached politically and really.
So, of course, what you're raising is the kind of the profound challenge that India faces, but it doesn't face it alone. This problem is not purely an Indian problem. Over the last 30 years, you have had in the world a kind of efflorescence of liberal cosmopolitan values ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. The massive expansion of globalization, the creation of a much more interconnected economy, the rise of technologies that kind of bound the world together. And that has over time produced a huge backlash. And we are living with that backlash today. It's not just happening in India, it's happening in the United States, where precisely the rhetoric you point out is being deployed in India is being deployed in the United States. J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller say quite clearly and unequivocally, America's diversity is a weakness. It is a problem. It is not a strength. It should not be celebrated. Pete Hegseth gave a speech to that effect or made remarks to that effect. And it's not just the United States. I mean, if you look at the direction that many European countries are going, the direction that Israel is going, the direction that Turkey has gone, it is all a backlash against these values. So the question I wonder about is, that the very fact that it's happening everywhere makes me feel that this is a pendulum, that this is a backlash. And sometimes backlash seems very powerful, but you shouldn't forget, you should never mistake the undertow for the wave. At the end of the day, the world is moving forward. You cannot imagine a global economy that doesn't stay connected, globalized in some way or the other. As people get more and more educated, will they not, move in? Will some of these things not reassert themselves in a way that makes it more likely that there is pushback? Are we seeing some of that pushback already? And I also think that India, in that sense, is a lot like the United States in that there is an inherent diversity in America that makes it very hard to impose this monocultural vision. And it feels very top-down and political compared to a bottom-up pluralism and tolerance that exists. I mean, you know this. You raised your kids, your son in America. I've raised kids in America. America is an amazingly tolerant country. It's one of the reasons why immigrants from all over the world want to come here, because Americans are naturally incredibly warm, welcoming. So there's the political project that you described, but then there is the actual lived reality of what America is, and how much is that political project going to be changed? I wonder about the same thing in India. India is by nature enormously diverse. Yes, there are all the documents you talk about in the Hindu nationalists. And of course, obviously, I find them appalling and distressing. And the lived reality for Muslims in India has become one, that is very, very difficult. But there are, there are older documents in India. The Rig Veda has these extraordinary verses where it talks about, does God exist? And the Rig Veda says, well, who knows? I mean, to have a religious document in one of its central verses expressing genuine ambiguity about whether or not God exists, that is a level of tolerance that is very difficult to imagine in the world of the Ten Commandments and things like that. And I just point out one final point. I agree with everything you're saying, and my prediction is not a prediction as much as it is a hope. But when Modi came into America, and he made that speech, and he used that phrase, "Hazar Saal ki Gulami," I couldn't help but maybe not smile, but be amused by the fact that the word he used for slavery, gulami, is an Urdu word, not a Hindi word. It's a word that comes out of the 1,000-year encounter between Islam and India.
Thank you. Let's open it up. Questions, would you also introduce yourself so that our speaker knows? So let's start here. Let's start with Ria, then we come to Andy. Yeah. I'll go for two here. Okay, yeah. So, right.
I'm Ria. I'm a PhD student in history.
And an accomplished guitarist.
And a guitarist. Thank you for your talk. I would like to ask you / push back on your characterization of India as a kind of naturally liberal democratic place. And in particular, I'm thinking of Dr. Ambedkar's famous quote that, democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic. And Ambedkar is talking about caste. But this is also true on the level of state making and policy. And even the first decade of Nehruvian rule, you have the thoroughly undemocratic, borderline authoritarian collapse of various regional and state governments. So I guess I'd just like to hear your thoughts on is it really true that the kind of liberal foundations are something we can still cling to as hope for the future?
Can I add something to this very, very important question that Ria is asking? So one way to think about Hinduism, which you picked up beautifully, and the citation of Rig Veda here is very profound. I mean, that doctrinally it's tolerant, but internally in its social order, it's the exact opposite. So Ambedkar, a truly profound thinker, and coming from a Dalit background. Incidentally, a lot of people don't know this. A lot of Indians don't know this. Only Dalits know this, actually. That with 2 PhDs, one from Columbia and one from London School of Economics, between 1915 and 1930, right, he actually became the most educated leader in India of that time, and perhaps even till today. The education in that sense. All of India's leaders during the freedom movement were called to the bar in London. Right, that was the idea. Nehru, Patel, everyone took a law degree, and Gandhi took a law degree from Britain and from England, one of the great schools there, and that's it. This man went on to acquire a PhD in philosophy and law. It was possible to do that in political philosophy and law at Columbia, and then economics at right. So what he's talking about is, in some ways, is not only his experience, right, but also the exposure to the democracy as it existed at that time in America, and especially the great political theorist who was his mentor, John Dewey, who is remarkable to on these questions, and talks about democracy not only as a political system but also as a lived social reality, right? So the internal social rigidity.
So, Ria, you raised 2 separate issues, one of which is the state-making kind of illiberalism in India, and the second is the caste system. The state-making illiberalism, I would just say, look, every state is founded in some sense in an illiberal fashion. The nature of states and nations is they come into being for a variety of reasons, geopolitical, nationalist, and it's very difficult to come up with a kind of purely liberal rationale for a state, right? A state is, I want to create this space where we live together, and I'm going to define that however I want, and I'm going to exclude the people I want. And so there's something kind of almost inherently illiberal in creating a state. I think of every European state, and they're all, it's very hard to figure out how you would create a state. And that's why nationalism there's some tension between nationalism and liberalism. The mechanism by which you build the state maybe is inherently illiberal. And you saw this not so much with the periods you were describing, but even earlier. The way Patel created India was basically to go to every noble, Maharaja and say, if you don't cede authority, we will kill you effectively, or we will arrest you, we'll jail you, we'll send in the army, we'll take over. And he did it 350 times. And that was how the great Indian democratic state was born. But maybe that's inevitable, right? That's how states get born. It doesn't mean they can't then espouse certain values. But I agree that there's a tension. The broader one you're talking about, of course, is true. Look, I mean, the extraordinary thing about India is this deeply developed, sophisticated, and hierarchical caste system. I mean, if you read Homo Hierarchicus, you realize that this is what almost defines India. In some ways, India is in some ways the strongest has the strongest elements of continuity with a kind of deep past of almost any society in the world. If you ask yourself what language in the world today is spoken actively, energetically, that existed at the time that ancient Greek was spoken, it's Tamil, right? What religion that was practiced at the time of the ancient Greeks, even earlier, was practiced. So this hierarchy, which probably existed in many societies, though not nearly as developed and formalized, is true is part of India, and it comes out of a much, much older world. Look, again, the Indians, India has tried to tackle it. I don't know how successfully, but it has tried to tackle it with more aggressive measures than most societies with similar kinds of past things. Most Americans are stunned to hear of the level of, what would in America be called quotas in India that exist. But, and I have to often explain, you got to understand how much, if you think in America, you were trying to compensate for 300 or 400 years of slavery. This is trying to compensate for 5,000 years of casteism, of caste discrimination. But they do exist. There has been some backlash. But to me, one of the interesting realities, and I would love to hear what you or Ashu think about this, is that the Hindu nationalists, while in their first phase in power, were aggressively casteist, defined themselves a little bit consciously, but more subconsciously as a kind of upper middle caste phenomenon. Modi has not done that. He has actually reached out to the lower castes for cynical political reasons, but as a result, they have not undone a lot of the efforts that are being made to kind of remedy the old caste system. So it is India's original sin. But I think that it'd be hard to imagine, I'm not sure what, if you were a modern day Indian, that you would do today that could be more expansive and aggressive. And I say that understanding it hasn't been that successful. I was visiting India at the time the Mandal Commission report came out. And this is a commission that, as I remember it now, Kashu, correct me, did a survey and it found that despite 60 years of all these quotas and things like that, when you looked at the civil service in India, Brahmins make up about 2% of India, and they made up 95% of the top 1,000 jobs that were held in the civil service. So, something hadn't worked.
2% of South India.
2% of South India.
In my home state, they're in UP, which is the largest. Brahmins would be about 12 to 13%.
Right. So maybe 6-7% average.
South India for sure.
Yeah, but maybe 5-7% on average.
Yeah, not more than 10, let's say. Right. Not more than 9-10.
And they are, I think it was the top 1,200 jobs. They had 95, 98% of those jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about this sort of connection between global economic literacy and liberalism and local political illiberalism. Maybe it's partly the way you started the talk, but there was sort of this notion that sort of economic liberalism may be a threat, but it seems like the growth of India, as with many of the sort of poor states that have risen, as you characterized, that they're really strong supporters of this system of trade. And that even if the U.S. has gone off on some crazy adventure, that those institutions in some ways are stronger than they have ever been as side deals have been made and become more multi-stranded. So do we envision a potential world in which global economic liberalism persists and political liberalism sort of continues to be an issue, or do you really think that would be incompatible with each other?
No, I think you put it exactly right for the reasons you put it. It is a kind of remarkable thing to watch what's happening right now, which is the United States has become, as I say, the leading protectionist power in the world. But unlike, and this is a break with really 80 years of agenda setting, the U.S. is no longer setting the agenda. The way the rest of the world views the situation is, America is a problem that has to be dealt with. It's too important, too big, too innovative. We will make some kind of arrangement with America. But with the rest of the world, we want more free trade, not less. right? So you look at Canada. Not only is Canada striking free trade deals with Europe and India and the rest, it's actually doing more to internally liberalize its economy. There are huge barriers within Canada, within the various provinces. So Canada is net implementing more market and trade reform as a result of America's protectionism. The same, by the way, could be said of India. India has moved toward a greater embrace of free trade because of all this, because everyone needs growth. And the truth is, free trade works. And so it does raise people's standards of living. And so people are looking around. Now, unfortunately, the connection between economic liberalism and political liberalism, at least at this point, seems thinner than, John Locke and John Stuart Mill would have imagined. And that is one of the great challenges of the modern era. And that was what I was trying to get at in the illiberal democracy idea and article and book, that, we have a reality of an India that is becoming increasingly economically liberal and politically illiberal. And the same could be said, broadly speaking, of Turkey over the last 30 or 40 years. And you can go country and why is that, and how could that change? It's a much larger subject, but your characterization is exactly right. Patrick?
Thank you, Fareed. I really want to share your optimism, but in the spirit of Ashu's question, I want to push back a little bit and make a comment and then ask a very specific question. The comment is on your backlash comment, which is a really important. I think you're exactly right. Across the world, there's been a recent ethno-nationalism, illiberalism, this attack on diversity, cosmopolitanism, secularism. It is global, from Modi to Trump to Bolsonaro. But there's a difference. In India, that project is supported by elites. So the BJP is a party of elites, whether they're caste elites or class elites. And interestingly, the cities support it, right? So Mumbai, beginning with the Shiv Sena, now support for the BJP, Delhi. So these spaces of cosmopolitanism, of invention, of globalization are the social base of Hindutva. In the US, that's not the case, right? New York, Washington, Seattle, the elites, by and large, in the U.S. are not the MAGA supporters. They're more rural and non-college educated white. So that, for me, that's a concern, because when you have an alignment of a politics of reaction with a powerful elite social base, it does give pause. And this goes to your point. I think you're also really right. India has tremendous resources in its traditional pluralism. And as you said, in federalism, the South is still largely free of the impact of Hindutva. But you talked about the civic capacity and and Indian civil society has been extraordinarily powerful and inventive and transformative. During the UPA government, it was civil society actors who came in and built out the social rights-based welfare state. Tremendous progress. But as you say, the institutions have been eroded. In particular, and this what worries me the most, is the institution of journalism. And as a journalist, I'd love to get your thoughts on, we know that the legacy press in India today is not very critical of the government. A lot of it is actually controlled by conglomerates that are very close to the government. Most of the oppositional media now is largely online. So I just want to ask you, you know the media and journalists in India, and as a journalist yourself, what's your sense of the state of the media and journalism in India today?
Look, you raise a very important element of where the democratic decay has taken place in India. I would say it's the media and the courts are the two places I worry the most. And when you look in America, you see that the pushback has actually been strongest in the courts. The one thing that gives you a sense of hope in America is that courts have been extraordinarily tough at pushing back. In India, that isn't the case, and that's partly because the Indian judiciary works differently and is in some ways an arm of the government. And in part, I think it's honestly just maybe it's a less well-developed democracy. People are more willing, get more intimidated. It's easier to pressure them. They succumb. And that is true in media as well. I think that the extraordinary thing about what has happened to Indian media, and it is, as you characterize it, I don't disagree, particularly TV media, is that there is a stunning level of self-censorship. I think that what the government did was a couple of very high-profile examples, NDTV being the most important one, right? You choose you choose one example, you go after it, and then everyone falls in line. I was talking to a friend of mine who runs one of the largest TV newsrooms, and I said, "How much do you have to actively censor?" And he said to me, "What I'm going to tell you makes my life as an editor-in-chief very easy, but as an Indian citizen, very depressing, which is I've never had to censor. Everybody self-censors. They all know where the lines are. They all know what they're not supposed to do. And that, that is probably part of the kind of the way that people have accommodated themselves to these kind of situations always. It does worry me a lot in terms of the pushback. How do you, if you imagine getting out of this, there have to be some bastions of liberalism, I don't want to use the word resistance, but that maintain these values, that uphold them. And in India, you're right, it's the South to a large extent. And it's hard to find other places. By the way, if I can just say one point, the Indian elite story is a fascinating one, and you touched on it. It's because Modi and the Hindu nationalists mostly run against elites. And they're always talking about how it's these horrible cosmopolitan, English-speaking, Hindustani-speaking, which means a kind of melange of Hindi and Urdu elites. But they are themselves actually quite elite themselves. And so it's actually a story of two competing elites. One point is worth making about when one gets very gloomy about India. Just remember, the Hindu nationalists get about 36% of the vote. It's the nature of parliamentary democracy that then translates that 36 into, and it may be for political stability that's necessary, but one shouldn't forget that, a very large majority of Indians are not voting for Hindu nationalism.
The 36% of Indian vote translates into roughly 44% of Hindu votes. So even Mr. Modi does not have a majority of Hindu vote either.
Yeah.
So that's worth remembering, right? So I think in all the negative, in all the doubts we have, negative, not the right, doubts one might have about the sturdiness of pluralism, right? Whether it can survive, it is worth remembering that even today, Mr. Modi does not have more than even 50% of Hindu vote. It's 44% roughly. 50% would be quite a dangerous threshold to cross for us liberal thinkers and liberals anywhere in the world. Fayyad, and then Danny, and then I'll come to you, sir. Yeah. Fayyad Ali teaches political science at Harvard and is part of our Harvard Brown group.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed the talk. I'm maybe a little bit not as bullish on the optimism. But the point I wanted to touch on that is, you famously write in defense of liberal education. And so I wanted to just hear a little bit about how you're thinking as India thinks about its place perhaps in this liberal order. Like, we can think historically in India, some of the most prominent education institutions are technical institutions, right? And that's really where a lot of effort has gone, even in the past decades. And some of the prominent liberal education institutions in India have faced a lot of challenges in the current moment. And so I wonder how you think about the education component of it, right? We see this happening in some of the democracies you've talked about as well, the US, Turkey, et cetera, where higher education becomes a place for some of illiberalism to play out. And so as we think about the role India could play in liberal democracy, how should we think about the kind of education sector?
Yeah, look, it's very troubling what has happened to some of those Indian education institutions, Ashoka being the most important. My understanding from talking to people is things have actually, so there was a very active effort with, relating to a couple of very prominent professors where there was essentially censorship and political control, and people were punished for holding certain views. Things have died down. That level of political control is not quite as strong. And people now, again, have, it's sad to say, because it does sound a little bit more like living in an authoritarian system, is that people have figured out how far you can go, what lines you can cross, how much you can say certain things that, and it's, the lines are pretty tough at this point, particularly if it involves anything relating, for example, to Pakistan or something like that. So, it's another area where you worry a lot. I think that the one advantage in India is because so many people speak English and the internet is by and large not censored. They do have access to, all your writing, but on a day-to-day basis, that doesn't scale in a country like India, and that's very elite as a phenomenon. And that's one of the things these illiberal Democrats have realized, which is let the elites have their little, their small magazines. It doesn't matter if I get to control TV news. That's enough. That's where the masses get their information.
Danny is doing a PhD in political science, and we should add he's from mainland China.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Zakaria. So you talk about India's service-oriented economy.
Are you telling me you can speak Mandarin and Hindi?
No,
that would be a feat.
No, sorry. No. So you talk about India's service-oriented economy as an advantage because it doesn't come with the foreign policy implications of overcapacity and supply chain security. But I think many people also see it as a limit for India's growth potential because it's not my field. But I think for most large countries, they start out poor agricultural countries, and then they grow fast as manufacturing countries, and then they become rich as service-oriented economies. So I think India is in a place where it is service-oriented, but it's not rich. So, and I think most economists, when they talk about growth potentials, when they devise strategies, they talk about more manufacturing for India. So I'm wondering I'm curious to hear your assessments on that, whether it's like a double-edged sword at least. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, one of the extraordinary things about India is if you look at the last 20 years, as I say, it's the second fastest growing large economy in the world over the last 30 years. Over the last 10 years, it is the fastest growing large economy in the world. And yet, industrial employment as a percentage of total is flat. In other words, you are not seeing the normal trajectory of a fast growing developing country where the peasants move from the farms to the factories. That is not happening. By the way, it's also not happening in fast growing countries in Africa. It's not happening in Kenya. It's not happening in South Africa. It's not happening in Ghana. It's not happening in Nigeria. So there are two things I'd say. One is I do think that something has changed about the nature of the global economy. That China may be, or maybe Vietnam, the last countries to go through that classic industrialization of farms to factories. And the reason for this is because what has happened is manufacturing on a global scale has become something that can be done only using large amounts of software and automation. You cannot achieve the level of precision you need in global manufacturing today using human beings. We're just too incompetent, to be honest. I was talking to Mukesh Ambani about the polymer plants that he now has set up. And, labor is cheap in India, but these are highly automated polymer plants. And I asked him why. And he said, if you are to manufacture to global specifications, you have to use machines. You have to use software. There's just no way to do it. So there may be some piece of this that is a kind of stage of global manufacturing that is gone past what human beings can do, and certainly large numbers of human beings. And you see this, of course, when you look at factories in the US. They're highly automated. But the point is that the Indian factory has to compete with that US product now because it's a global market. You can't say, well, your shoes are half handmade and half machine made because they come from India. Like the Nike shoe has to be the Nike shoe. The second is that I think in India, there seems to be an enormous amount of bottom-up activity of a kind of local entrepreneurship that's taking place. Small companies, small, retail mom and pops of various kinds, where there is employment taking place, because there's real economic growth. And maybe again, this may be a slightly optimistic gloss on this, but maybe the Indian model is a new model where you have a lot of this disaggregated bottom-up growth. People are not moving as much to the cities. They're finding ways along the supply chains to find jobs. But it's certainly true that you are not having that classic farm to factory movement, and it is a limitation. You do see some, as my iPhone example illustrated. I mean, and that is happening in your classic farm to factory way. But it's not enough that it's moving. You're seeing it in the aggregate data. The aggregate data is showing that it's a little confusing, but partly because in India agriculture is so bizarre, right? Like there's a huge part of the economy. It is almost impossible to modernize because the subsidies are almost written into the constitution. There's a part of the constitution is you can't tax agricultural income. So there's one huge subsidy. So, in a very weird way, when I used to go to India and China 20 years ago, I would talk to the Chinese and say, how are you going to achieve economic growth? And they would say, it's very simple. You got to move people off the farms onto factories, and that's what will create growth. And the Indians would say, we can't move people off the farms to factories, so we're going to provide all these rural subsidies that will keep them in the farms and raise their standards of income. So the Indians were behaving like communists and the Chinese were behaving like capitalists. And to a certain extent, that still exists.
Danny Roderick is among those economists who's been arguing now for 10 years that industrialization, manufacturing is out for India. It's not going to happen. And he, of course, uses the global economy for that. We have economists sitting here who can tell us whether he was the first one to make that argument. I promised to go at the back. Yes, sir. Could you also introduce yourself? If I know you, I would introduce you to the speaker. But yeah.
Hi, Fareed. Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Toss. I'm a senior, and my dad also can't live without your show.
Okay.
I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more about India's comparative advantage to some of its other peers in South Asia, specifically the Indian subcontinent, such as Bangladesh and Pakistan. And also, if you can speak about why India is the natural balancer to China as opposed to South Korea or Japan.
Sure. So, the fundamental reason why India is the best balancer is scale. The thing about China that is sort of difficult to comprehend and that nobody else can quite manage to achieve is just the sheer scale and the ability to be able to deploy that scale in a way that, if you look at China right now, it's not just rare earths. 90% of the precursor chemicals for penicillin are in China. 75 to 80% of the precursor chemicals for ibuprofen and Tylenol are in China. So it's all these areas where China has accumulated these massive, massive supply chain kind of commanding positions. Well, what other country that is, has reasonably low cost labor that could amass something on that scale, could be as crucial a part of the supply chain, but would be part of a kind of Western ecosystem or an ex-China ecosystem. You can imagine some of the other countries having a part or in some area, but South Korea is too rich, honestly, to be playing a part in some of these precursor chemicals. India is, both the right size, not so rich that it becomes impossible to imagine. India's role vis-a-vis its neighbors, the truth is, there should be, if those countries were able to get their acts together, they would provide a kind of healthy competition for India. Pakistan could easily do that because Pakistan was in many ways, Pakistan never went down the kind of crazy socialist path that India did. During the 70s with bank nationalizations and all of that period. Pakistan was always more business friendly. If you look at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, I haven't looked at this particular thing recently, but certainly 10 years ago when I looked at it, Pakistan was like 50 points higher than India on the ease of doing business because it hadn't gone through that kind of crazy socialist period. But Pakistan is kind of it's a dysfunctional country with a military that owns the country. And that problem has never been complete. It just weighs it down in a way that makes it impossible for it to function. So, Sri Lanka has its ethnic problem. Bangladesh has, so they, each of them in a strange way have a political problem that has kept them from being economically vibrant. They've had periods of economic vibrancy, but they've never really been able to be on a sustained basis economically vibrant, which in my opinion is bad for India. I mean, it would be much better for India if it were able to have healthy, open competition. With Pakistan, it doesn't matter what Pakistan does because there's zero trade between the two countries, which is a pity. But you could imagine a South Asia which would be much more economically vibrant and competitive, which would help everyone.
This is also an argument that, for example, Lee Kuan Yew, at least when I was in Singapore and he made a speech, something like that, he said that there was a Hong Kong available to China when it started growing. Right? From Shenzhen, you could walk to Hong Kong, actually. Yeah. 5 miles, that's it. There was no Hong Kong available to India. The Colombo was not a Hong Kong, right? Yeah. Karachi was not a Hong Kong. Dhaka could not imagine being in Hong Kong. Right? So there is a sense in which China's surroundings helped it enormously, and India did not have that fortune. Right? It's something similar. You're saying. Let's go to. I promised you, and then we go back there. Yeah. Yes.
By the way, Ria's research touches on this, but there's one scenario in which it could have happened, which is if Bombay had been treated as a centrally administered separate territory, you could have had Bombay be the problem with the cosmopolitan city is that it always gets taken over by the nationalist hinterland. Which then throttles its economic vibrancy,
which has happened to Hong Kong now,
right? Because it got taken over by the right. The only places where it doesn't happen is where it's a city-state, like Singapore. Exactly.
Bombay had to become part of either Maharashtra or Gujarat. That was the only option. Options available. Right. And Nehru was actually in favor of a centrally administered Bombay for some time. Politically, it was a no-go. Right. Yes, sir. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ramakrishnan, and I'm a parent of a Brown student.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I have a story. My father, who's passed away, was a conservative South Indian Brahmin, right? Extremely religious. But his closest friends were a Muslim and a Christian. But those days are gone, right?
Even in South India? You're from South India?
Yeah, I'm from Madras. Those days are gone in the sense that I see more push amongst the Brahmins to be coherent with the BJP. Right, I see that they feel that the BJP is looking out for them, whatever that is. Right. So my question is, do you see South India staying a bulwark against the BJP? I mean, you see the delimitation problems where, Tamil Nadu and Kerala states are going to potentially lose Lok Sabha because they follow the rules, right? And more religious tolerance in Tamil Nadu and Kerala compared to the other states. Do you see South India confronting the federal government on a continuous basis, which we are seeing already? Or do you see BJP taking over those states also at some point?
Just to add, for clarification here for the audience that doesn't follow Indian politics closely as the two of us do, the South India was roughly 25% of India, or 1/4 of India. And delimitation, because it's been able to successfully contain population growth, 2 states of India and now almost 3 states of India are below replacement level now. This is how successful they have been in controlling population growth, which is not true of North India, except 1 state only in North India. So this could reduce the strength of South India in Indian Parliament from 25% to almost 20 or 19. Despite having great economic success. So politically, it might become more marginal, but economically is actually, if you see Subramaniam and Kapoor's book, South India in the last 15 years has been growing at Chinese rates. Right?
It's four times the North.
Yeah.
South India grows 4 times the pace of North India. Look, it feels like there is a clash coming between the center and the South. And in some ways, if you were to imagine, you could imagine history replaying itself. The monopoly of power that the Congress Party had in the 1960s was first broken by the South on linguistic issues, Nijlingappa and Kamraj. And that could replay itself with the added dimension that you're talking about of a South worrying that it's becoming economically more vibrant but politically weaker. The thing the thing that makes it different, honestly, is Modi. Modi is a very shrewd politician, and he is well aware of exactly the problem you are describing. And the BJP is putting enormous energy into trying to gain a foothold in the South. Maybe it won't work, maybe it will. I'm not honestly close enough to know that. But it's very clear that the BJP is well aware of the issue you're describing and views it as, a problem for them to solve for themselves. Will they be able to? I don't know. But it certainly is, the one looming tension in Indian politics that people don't talk a lot about, because the South so far has been willing not to contest the North, just to not do, not to do what they're doing and to kind of just keep growing, getting richer and richer. And there's really an extraordinary, I can't remember the exact statistic, but when you look at manufacturing jobs in India, they're basically all in Tamil Nadu. They're all in the Madras area and the Chennai area. And when you look at the number of women employed in manufacturing, I believe it's something like 80% of all Indians are in that one small state.
The iPhone factories are basically all women.
Yeah.
This is a remarkable development.
Basically. Well, you know why it is? It's because in what Indians have learned, if you've ever been to a tea plantation in India, all the people picking the tea are women. And it's because women have, as was explained to me, better eyesight, more consistent, they don't drink, and they show up on time. So
all 4 might have mattered in iPhone also, with greater literacy added.
Yeah.
With greater literacy added.
Yeah.
I promised you, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
Hi, Fareed. Thank you for being. Oh, thank you.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, of course. My name is Luke Drymergram. I'm a senior here. I think apparently, like everyone here, my father is also a huge fan of your show, as am I.
Many fathers with impeccable taste, I have to.
Yes, who imparted that taste to their sons. Yes. I don't know much about domestic politics in India, but I study India a little bit in terms of it being, part of great power competition and just in terms of international relations. So I was interested in your take on how India's ascension to great power status could, in some ways, kind of reignite the spirit of the liberal international order. And the reason I found that interesting is because, from my perspective, the way I see Indian foreign policy, not allying with, but pursuing ties with Russia when it makes sense to them, pursuing ties with America, Israel, kind of triangulating, if you will, to me, that kind of signifies that if India were to become a true global great power, that would almost further entrench the Trumpian kind of foreign policy, if you will, where every country is kind of doggedly pursuing their own self-interest without a grand strategy that they would be willing to sacrifice for, and like values, or, it'd be hard for me to imagine India embracing anything like a responsibility to protect doctrine, for example. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that is how India currently operates. And I guess my hope is two things happen. One, it realizes that there isn't much benefit to be gained from being particularly closely allied with Russia and China. China is, first of all, very difficult. The levels of suspicion are sufficiently great, and the levels of mistrust and the kind of natural geopolitical rivalry that exists with China means they're never going to get too close to China. With Russia, I think what Indians are recognizing is Russia is a declining second-rate power. The Russian economy is the size of Florida's economy. This is not a country to hitch your wagon to, and India recognizes that. I think that India used to buy, I think I have these numbers roughly right. It used to buy about 50 or 60% of its weaponry from Russia. It's already down to 40%. Some of the weaponry that it still buys, it buys because it has to, because it has old weaponry. But it's moving away from a reliance on Russian arms. In terms of technology, if there is going to be a kind of bifurcated world with a kind of Chinese stack and a non-Chinese stack, a Western stack, India is clearly going to be part of the Western stack. If you want to see, by the way, the savviness of an Indian businessman, the entire geo stack. This is the most impressive cellular phone system in India that Reliance operates. The entire geo stack has not a single Chinese component, and was built 10 years ago. So anticipating what was going to happen. So I think India has a kind of natural affinity, both economically and in terms of values. So far, it is behaving like a scrappy middle power, doing just cutting the best deals it can with everybody. Maybe was America that different when it was a scrappy middle power? My point is that as India gets more powerful, it has the opportunity to express not just its power, but its values. And maybe it'll express the values that are within its DNA and within its core. So it's more a hope than a prediction. But when countries become richer, they do go beyond merely looking after their material interests. So almost the definition of a great power is a country whose security is assured and can act in ways that are beyond just looking after its core security.
While we are on this topic about international relations of India, the newest big player in India's strategic calculations and an attempt at friendship is Israel. And while weaponry imports from Russia are declining, they're rising quite phenomenally when it comes to Israel and France to some extent, right? Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on how the closeness between India and Israel figures in your idea about the rise of India, or values, or simple materiality of interest? Any thoughts on that? This new development?
Sure. Look, at one level, it is the rise of Indian pragmatism and the sort of multi-aligned idea, right? Like of trying to find the best places you can work with, and that has very much been part of not just dealing with Israel, but reaching out to whomever you needed to. At another level, I think it reflects a certain recognition that the old Indian foreign policy, which was much more anti-Israel and pro-Arab, had run its ground. Because it was rooted in a kind of fantasy that Israel was going to disappear which is not going to happen, right? And so some of it was coming to that realization. But another part of it is with it very clearly an ideological outgrowth of Modi's own, domestic ideology. There is a sense of affinity. There is a sense of shared hostility to some of the same people, shared hostility to Muslims, to Islam, to particularly Islamic fundamentalism. I remember when the Gaza operation began, there was a group of BJP types who tried to raise a kind of French Foreign Legion or an Abraham Lincoln Brigade to go to Israel. The idea would be, you could go there and fight the good fight. Obviously, I think that's a small phenomenon, but I think it's all those things. I think it would be a mistake to view it as purely kind of Hindutva ideology or purely material. It's a kind of combination of all those things. And the old ideology had kind of, as it collapsed, by the way, for the Gulf Arabs themselves.
For the UAE.
Right, for the UAE, for Saudi, because those people also came to realize, look, Israel is here. Our choice is whether or not to have practical relations with them or to continue this fantasy. And they ended the fantasy.
Well, you're there. Let's start with, yeah.
Hi.
Let's take two questions now.
Okay. Shekhar Pradhan, until recently a faculty member in the Data Science Institute at Brown. Also grew up in the Bombay that very much part of my lived experience. So this is a question I've been wanting to ask you for a long time, and I'm thrilled to have this opportunity. And you kind of touched on it earlier. So when India and Pakistan became independent, they were economically roughly similar. And at least for the first decade, Pakistan's per capita income was higher than India. But now, of course, completely divergent economic fortunes. And you said it was because the army controlled it. But and surely, of course, that's true. But I was wondering to what extent, what happened at partition made a difference. At partition, the Hindu trading communities, the Banya communities, the various jatis obviously stayed in India, but the Muslim trading communities like the Memons and the Bohris and other Gujarati Muslim trading communities stayed in India, whereas the Sindhis, which were the largest trading community in Pakistan, moved to India. So while both countries were feudal, India's feudalism was balanced by these vibrant trading communities and the jatis, whereas Pakistan didn't have any of that. Does you think that's a reasonable explanation, a part of the explanation?
Well, and the second question comes from Calcutta. We have so far not included Calcutta in our conversation. So Kolkata, please. Introduce yourself.
My name is Ahuna. I'm a PhD student in the anthropology department. And I think this is just a much better version of the question that I'm trying to ask. There's a group of social scientists and cultural theorists who have recently kind of called to re-ask the question of the global beyond a West versus non-Western paradigm, right? As well as beyond a kind of wounded post-colonial subjectivity, right? So Professor Sudipto Kaviraj, for instance, did a wonderful series of lectures that asked what exactly is Western about Western thought without treating it as a given. So in the spirit of asking what is Indian about India, which I think is one of the objectives of our lecture today, I wanted to ask what you thought was specific about the Indian conception of Islam and whether it was distinct from not Western, but other neighboring regional conceptions of Islam. I thought the most wonderful part of your lecture was the story of your uncle, the Imam, who could go as Santa Claus to a Christmas party, right? But how does one conceptualize that without resolving it within a foundational pluralism, which, as we know, and also as a reminder from Ria's question, isn't quite straightforward, right? So those of us who have read the Vedas know, or some of it, know that India isn't doctrinally tolerant either, right? The Vedas are implicitly hinging on a question of violence and violence between neighboring groups, right? And so I wanted to ask if you thought that there was an Indian Islam that was distinct and what particular values that contained.
On the India-Pakistan issue, look, you're of course right, and some of it has to do with many different factors. I mean, at the end of the day, India was basically poor until Manmohan Singh's reforms. And after that, it's actually grown at roughly the same pace, despite there being 4 different governments. So if you were to ask yourself, what is the single most important thing that happened? It was the liberalization in the early 1990s that took India on a different path that Pakistan did not go on. But more broadly, I think the big story of success in Asia is largely correlated to land reform. So the places where you see land reform, you see a structure of both economics and politics that makes it possible for it to happen. So in India, it's by the way, the reason the South is so much more productive is not, I'm sure some South Indian friends would disagree that they're so much smarter. It's that there was actually quite widespread land reform in the South, and there was very little in the North, which remained an old Zamindar culture. Pakistan kept the old Zamindar culture in droves. I mean, to an extent that's really quite astonishing to somebody from India to realize, like, the Bhutto family's land holdings in Pakistan are in the thousands, if not tens of thousands of acres. And that's true of all these big families. So that probably is the largest part of it. But you're right that the trading communities, Gujarat in particular, probably play a very important role in maintaining capitalism in India. I mean, one of the reasons I think India punches above its weight on some of these issues is it has a very old established business class. So Indian companies are actually very well managed compared to almost any third world. They use capital very efficiently, because if you go back to China 25 years ago had no capitalist class. It had no managerial class. It had, nobody who knew how to use private capital. Whereas India had these old families that these firms that had existed for 100, 150 years and had successfully survived through that whole process. So I think that has a lot to do with it. You ask a very interesting question about Islam in India. It's not unique, but it's very special because mostly Islam exists as a majority community almost everywhere. If you look at the OIC, it's mostly Muslim majority countries. Islam in India has always been a minority, even when it was the ruling minority, which means it has always had to accommodate itself to a larger culture in which it had to be in some way a part. And so I think the nature of Islam in India, first of all, the nature of Muslim life in India has always been to understand that you are the minority. So that the psychological reality of a Muslim in India is more similar to a Jew in Europe in the 18th, 19th century than it is to some, other Muslim country, where you are always aware that you had these peculiar practices and these particular faith that nobody else, very few people you knew, but you found a way to navigate within it. The difference, and this is what I was trying to get at my point about celebration, is Islam in India, maybe because it's been around for 1,000 years, maybe because there are periods when it was the ruling elite. There's an extraordinary amount of mixture, of synchronism. So that you think of the idea of Urdu and Hindi existing as two languages. Urdu and Hindi basically are the same language. They have the same grammatical structure, which largely derives from Sanskrit. But Hindi derives its vocabulary from Sanskrit, and Urdu derives its vocabulary from Persian and from a little bit from Arabic. So if you're saying, I am going to the store, the words I am going to would be identical in both languages, and store would be different because one would be a Persian derivative and one would be a Sanskrit derivative. There's no other two languages in the world that have that kind of bizarre shared symbiosis. Or you take Indian music. You listen to a great ghazal. Ghazals are the kind of distinctive
She's a musician too.
All right. So the distinctive, I'm saying for most people, expression of Indian Islam in music. And what the ghazal has, and if the great singers would do, is the entire musical structure is based on Hindu music, rags, right? But the overlay is Persian poetry. So you have put Persian poetry to the tune, to the underlying structure of what was the traditional Indian. Again, I can think of very few places in the world where you have that kind of melange that has taken place. And that's what I always thought was just amazing about India. Was this crazy mixture that you saw where nobody felt the need to ever kind of take it apart. It was just the way it is. Like, I can think of very few, there's very little of that I've at least found in other places where you had, culture 1 and culture 2. But what in India you ended up with was culture 3, which was a kind of strange melange.
Last question.
Wait, I have a pushback.
No, we can continue this over. Right. Last question from Parag. Yeah. Before we,
this was a wonderful discussion and an examination of the facts, and an expose, if you will, because of the audience. Is there a role here, given the sandboxes or the pulpits you have, for a prescription, given the circumstances that we have? So we admire the rise into the 5th, 4th, 3rd economies, but gently point out that GDP per capita relative to other countries has not moved much, right? That the ease of business is a noble goal, but if we benchmark ourselves similarly against the ease of business in other countries that we admire, that there is room to go there. So the point I'm making is, beyond just the facts, how can we be more prescriptive in a way that would actually be constructive given the limitations of the governance that exists?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you make is an important one, because I find that when you go to India these days, there's an enormous amount of self-satisfaction. There's a sense that, we're doing great, the world is coming knocking on our doors, and some of these realities that you're describing are not as well understood. Look, you can talk about it, you can write it, but there is the reality is that India is also a vast internal economy and a vast internal society. One of the things I'm always struck by in India is you go there, and if you read the newspapers or watch TV, it's as if the rest of the world doesn't exist. There's almost no discussion of it outside of that. And if you look at, not the English language newspapers, the Hindi newspapers, that really is no discussion of it. So, maybe that's inevitable. I mean, 1.4 billion people, and God knows there's a lot going on inside India. I remember bringing one of my college friends to India for the first time, and he said after 2 or 3 days of trying to read the Indian newspapers, he said, "Does somebody have a kind of a cheat sheet with all the acronyms that are used in the Indian, CID to MPCC, there's just all this entirely internal Indian language about what's going on in the country." As you know, I'm trying to create a kind of India-US tech corridor to gently remind Indians that they don't really have much of a tech industry. What they think of as a tech industry is really a labor arbitrage industry of cheaper engineers and cheaper accountants and cheaper lawyers. So you can do it in those ways, and people at that level know it, but it's a hard one because you have a very, it's a little bit like America in some ways. These large continental countries that have vast internal dynamics and preoccupations are not that interested in the rest of the world. What's unusual again about India, if you compare it to, say, a Brazil, a Russia, a US, these other big China, you have this class of about 15% of the country that speaks English, that is connected into the global conversation. And maybe, that is, again, a hope that has a kind of effect of creating a modernizing impulse that doesn't exist in some of those other societies.
All good things must come to a close. And it's time to thank. Thank you.